In the winter of 1812, an army of over 600,000 men marched into the heart of Russia. They were the pride of Europe, the soldiers of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who had conquered kingdoms, crowned himself emperor, and believed no force on earth could defy his will. When they crossed the river Niemen, they sang songs of victory and glory. When they returned, only a few thousand remained. This is not a legend. This is the story of Napoleon's lost army, the frozen disaster that shattered an empire and changed the world forever. By 1812, Napoleon ruled almost all of Europe. France was at the height of its power. His armies had crushed Austria, humbled Prussia, and forced even mighty Spain to its knees. But far to the east stood one empire that refused to bow, Russia. Tsar Alexander I had once been Napoleon's ally, but their friendship had turned to rivalry. The reason was simple: control of Europe's economy. Napoleon's continental system was meant to isolate Britain, his greatest enemy, by forbidding all European nations from trading with it. But Russia depended on British goods. When the Tsar secretly reopened his ports to British ships, Napoleon saw it as betrayal. And betrayal, in Napoleon's mind, could only be answered with war. In the spring of 1812, he began assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen. 600,000 soldiers, French, Polish, German, Italian, Dutch, Belgian, even Swiss, marched under the eagle of France. They called it La Grande Armée, the Great Army. It was more than a force, it was a continent on the move. Napoleon promised his men that the campaign would be swift. He believed that once Moscow fell, the Tsar would have no choice but to surrender. He had conquered nations before in a matter of weeks. Why not Russia? On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the river Niemen into Russian territory. The weather was warm, the skies clear. Officers wore polished boots and bright uniforms. Soldiers marched in perfect lines, carrying banners of every color. The emperor himself rode at the front, silent, confident, unstoppable. To the men, it felt like the march of destiny. But as soon as they entered Russia, they realized something was wrong. The Russians did not meet them in battle. There were no great armies waiting, no glorious fight. The Russian commanders, Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, had chosen a different strategy: retreat and burn everything behind them. Villages, crops, bridges, all destroyed. The French advanced, but found only ashes. It was the scorched earth policy. The Russians gave ground, but denied the invaders every resource. The farther Napoleon marched, the more desperate his men became. Food grew scarce. Water turned foul. The summer heat was unbearable. Horses collapsed by the hundreds. Every day, men died without ever seeing an enemy. By the time Napoleon reached the city of Smolensk in August, thousands had already fallen to hunger, exhaustion, and disease. The city burned as the Russians retreated again, leaving only smoke and ruins. Napoleon was furious. "They burn their own cities," he shouted. "What kind of people destroy their homeland?" But he pressed on, deeper into the vast emptiness of Russia. Finally, in early September, the Russians turned to fight. Near a small village called Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow, they built fortifications and prepared to make a stand. On the morning of September 7, 1812, the French army attacked. The Battle of Borodino was one of the bloodiest days in human history. Over 250,000 men fought on that single field. Cannons thundered, muskets roared, and waves of soldiers clashed in a storm of smoke and fire. The air itself seemed to burn. At the Ravsky Redoubt, French infantry charged uphill again and again into the teeth of Russian cannon fire. Men fell in heaps, and the wounded lay writhing in the mud. A French officer later wrote, "The ground trembled as if alive. You could not see your own hand through the smoke." Napoleon watched from a hilltop, silent, cold, his face grim. When the fighting ended after 12 brutal hours, the French held the field, but it was no victory. 30,000 of Napoleon's men were dead or wounded. The Russians lost 45,000. And still, Tsar Alexander refused to surrender. Napoleon entered Moscow a week later. He expected to find peace negotiations waiting for him, a message, an envoy, something. Instead, the city was empty. The streets were silent. Its people had fled. The emperor set up his headquarters in the Kremlin and waited. Then, one night, fires broke out across the city. At first, a single house burned, then another. By dawn, the entire city was an inferno. Flames devoured homes, churches, palaces. Explosions rocked the streets as stores of gunpowder ignited. French soldiers tried to fight the fire, but the wind carried the flames faster than they could run. By the third day, 3/4 of Moscow was destroyed. Napoleon stood on a balcony, watching the city burn. They would rather destroy their capital than surrender it, he murmured. In that moment, he realized the Russians would never yield. He waited in the ashes of Moscow for more than a month. No peace offer came. The autumn winds turned colder. Food grew scarce. Horses died. Soldiers froze at night. Napoleon knew he had to retreat, but he hesitated, waiting for a letter, a miracle, anything. Finally, on October 19th, 1812, he gave the order. The army would march back to France. It was already too late. The first snow fell as the army left Moscow. Within days, the temperature dropped below freezing. The soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and poorly dressed for the Russian winter. Frostbite turned fingers black. Muskets jammed with ice. Boots fell apart. Men wrapped themselves in rags, in blankets torn from the dead, anything to keep warm. Horses died by the thousands. Carts were abandoned. Cannons left behind. The Grande Armée, once the mightiest in Europe, had become a shivering, starving mob. As they staggered west, Russian Cossack cavalry appeared, swift, merciless raiders who attacked the columns and vanished into the snow. Every night, more men vanished. Some froze. Some deserted. Some lay down in the snow and never woke again. "The snow blinds us," one survivor wrote. "The cold bites through bone. We eat the flesh of our dead horses." Napoleon rode among the survivors, his face hidden beneath layers of fur, his eyes hollow. "This is not war," he said quietly. "It is the wrath of heaven." In late November, the remnants of the army reached the Berezina River, a wide, freezing torrent blocking their way to safety. The bridges had been destroyed. On the opposite bank, the Russian army waited. Under fire and freezing wind, Napoleon's engineers built 2 makeshift bridges out of broken wagons and timbers. Tens of thousands tried to cross. Horses fell into the ice. Cannons sank. Men trampled one another in panic. When the bridges finally collapsed, the river was filled with bodies. By the time the survivors reached the other side, tens of thousands were gone. The Grande Armée, the pride of Europe, was destroyed. On December 5th, near the town of Smorgoni, Napoleon called his generals together. He told them he was leaving, returning to Paris to rally new forces. "The army is lost," he whispered to his aide. "But I must save France." He rode away in a small sleigh through the snow, leaving behind the men who had followed him to the ends of the earth. When he arrived in Paris, he announced that the campaign had been a success, that the army had achieved its goals. But everyone knew the truth. Of the 600,000 soldiers who had crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. The rest were dead, captured, or missing, swallowed by the snow. The invasion of Russia broke the spell of Napoleon's invincibility. Across Europe, his enemies rose again. Within 2 years, Paris itself would fall, and Napoleon would be forced to abdicate. His empire, once unstoppable, had died in the snows of Russia. Later, in exile, Napoleon reflected on that fateful campaign. "The snow and the Cossacks destroyed me," he said. But it was not just snow. It was pride, the arrogance of believing that no power, not even nature itself, could stand against him. Today, 2 centuries later, Russian farmers still find buttons, coins, and bones buried in the fields, the last remains of those who marched with the emperor. They dreamed of glory, but found only silence beneath the snow. Their frozen footprints remain, carved into the history of human ambition, a warning whispered through time. For in 1812, it was not just Napoleon's army that froze in Russia. It was his dream of empire, his vision of destiny, frozen forever in the white wastelands of winter.